I'm gonna go in hiding. I'll be back.
Okay.
My face on there? No.
And for everybody else, if you guys could, if you could just put your name and what market center you're in the chat window, that'd be great.
Oh, I should be on there too. If you want, but it's kind of stupid because we'll have, well, unless we turn on one, it doesn't matter to me.
And then if you guys also have any questions, you guys can also go ahead and post it into the chat. And then Greg, while you're sharing screen, I'll just monitor the chat window for you.
Sounds good. That's perfect.
Okay.
All right.
We'll try to hold all the questions towards the end of the class, just to save you on time to get through the material.
I mean, to be perfectly honest, though, James, I have kind of an outline. I'll pop it up in a minute. So as things come up, some of the questions might be somewhat pertinent. So I'm not completely object to taking them as we go to a point.
All right, sounds good.
So.
Thank you.
Move that there. Alrighty. Yeah, we'll give it another minute or two and then we can get going. This.
Always good to see so many beautiful faces.
Type print names. All right.
Hey, Carrie, haven't seen you in a while.
I know. It's been a long time since I've been in the office. It's coming.
Yeah.
Things are getting better.
All right. Should we get going?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
All right. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Greg Voorhees. I am a real estate attorney. My office is located out in Medford. I know I see some familiar faces and a lot of familiar names. I've worked with many of you on here and I've spoken at Keller Williams a few times. So it's good to see everybody. Hope everybody's been doing well and I'm sure everybody's been staying busy. So as we get towards the beginning of the year, James, Leon, and I were talking, and it's kind of always good to kind of hit a refresh, discuss some things in terms of the contract and kind of just the generalities, making sure that, you know, have a chance to answer any questions, kind of go through anybody that's never had one of these and discuss the contract. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and I have a little outline that I'm going to kind of work my way through, and I'll basically be going back and forth between that and some excerpts of the contract. So we can kind of just work our way from paragraph 1 all the way through to the very end. And I'll be happy to take questions as we go. I'll kind of highlight some things that are items that I run into a lot of times, discuss some things that I address in attorney review and that some attorneys address in attorney review, and then some pitfalls and things that are often causes for questions or concerns that people have along the way as well. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can make this work and share my screen to this. And hopefully you all see something that's entitled 2021 NJ Real Estate Contract at the top with my name. All right, beautiful. So like I said, I'm going to kind of flip between this and the contract as we go through. But what I want to start with is, you know, obviously as agents, you have the ability to put together a real estate contract. And the advantages of doing that is that you're able to immediately start a process to get the ball rolling, whether that be as a buyer to submit offers in the form of a contract, or sellers to get the contracts out to buyers right away so you can get things moving. You're not sitting around having to wait on somebody else to put it together. But that means that there's information that you obviously need to have in order to begin that process and you know, get the parties locked in together. So what I've started off with here is probably fairly obvious, but believe it or not, there are plenty of situations where I see contracts that have come that are missing information or have half the information. And so it's really important when you're going through and completing a contract, that you provide all the pertinent information that's necessary. So here you should all be able to see the first page of the contract. Obviously, buyers' names, sellers' names, and their current addresses. This is just information. It's to get things started so that we make sure we have everybody that's involved in the transaction identified. It's important to make sure that you spell everybody's names correctly, because otherwise you're going to create more work for yourself on the back end by having to do addendums, to change spelling, to add, remove middle initials. So a lot of times, if you're a buyer's agent, coordinate with the lender, find out what they have on their contract and their loan documents, so that everything can be consistent. Otherwise, the lender is going to pester you to add or remove an initial or do something along those lines. The property address is fairly self-explanatory, but adding in the block and lot information, that's something that's a public record. So if you don't have the familiarity with how to do that, there's a web page you can go to, find the block and lot for any property in the state, plug that in right away, and then that way there's no question as to what property you're dealing with. And so that way when the title companies get involved, everything matches up and you don't have any confusion. Section 2, obviously, is probably what I would say would be the most important. Aside from that, is you need to make sure your purchase price is correct and your mortgage information.
Okay.
Now,
I'm in class.
one thing that we will see as we go through is this contract does not mention anything about appraisals, appraisal contingencies, or things of that nature. So it is incredibly important to make sure that the information that is plugged in here on the mortgage section, and then again on page 3 in section 3D, is accurate. Because like I said, the contract doesn't talk about what happens if the property doesn't appraise. So the closest that you have as a buyer, without making modification of the contract, to having an appraisal contingency is to ensure that whatever your buyer is going to be obtaining as a mortgage is listed here. So please make sure you coordinate this with your buyers, with the lender, to make sure that this information is accurate and that the deposits and the balance of the purchase price are accurate. Again, these are all things that can be changed by addendums later, but if you get to a point where a property under appraises, if you have the wrong mortgage information and they're still able to get the mortgage, and you have a buyer, it might not provide your buyer as much protection as if you have things correct, it falls short, and then you're able to have the ability to open up some discussions in terms of appraisals. We're going to talk a little bit more about appraisals as we go through with some of the other changes that can be made in the contract.
Excuse me, Greg.
Yes.
Are you showing the contracts or are you showing the outline still?
Oh, this is supposed to be showing the contract. Is that not coming up?
We're still on your outline screen.
Oh, sorry about that. I've been highlighting. I have to reshare. That's why I forgot the click button. So now you should be able to see the contract.
Yes.
Okay, good. So obviously here's this section. Thanks, James. This is the section I'm talking about entering obviously the buyer and seller information. Here's where it's important to have your mortgage information correct. Paragraph 2, and then especially here in paragraph 3, because you're going to be selecting a principal amount of mortgage here. You're going to be selecting the type of mortgage, which is obviously incredibly important. All right, you have your VA loans and your FHA loans, which, as I'm sure you all know, are specific type of loans. They're government backed. They have different qualifications and requirements associated with them. All right, so for a VA loan, you can have financing up to 100% of the purchase price. With an FHA loan, your client's going to be financing 96.5% of the purchase price. This also, of course, comes with it an addendum that you're going to have signed, the VA FHA amendatory clause, which provides your clients a great deal of protection as it relates to the appraised value of the property. All right, I'm going to share. So let's go back here.
Just hitting on that, Greg, a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure. So,
So let's say somebody's buying a $500,000 home, they're doing $400,000 financing.
Yep.
Just because a house doesn't appraise at 500, it's not necessarily saying that they can't purchase the property, correct?
That's correct, Jim. This is a good point. So let's dive into the appraisals a little bit now since we're here. So in your example, you have a 20% down buyer. They're financing 80% of the property. What that means is you've plugged in now a $400,000 mortgage in this section here. And then theoretically, that's going to most likely, I would have to imagine, be a conventional loan with a $400,000 principal amount there, and then either 15, 30 or whatever it may be. That's the only details that this contract provides as it relates to the mortgage. So let's say that the property appraises at $450,000. Based on the financial situation that's been plugged in here, you're now at a 90-10 ratio. As a conventional loan, many buyers are able to get a 10% down loan. And so all the contract speaks of here is whether or not the buyer can obtain a mortgage for $400,000? If the answer to that question is yes,
Yeah.
this contract in its current form does not provide any protection to the buyer in order to defray if there's a reduction in the appraised value. Essentially, at that point, it comes down to the lender. The lender will evaluate the financials, and if the lender can still issue a $400,000 mortgage, they can't issue a mortgage denial. And instead, you're going to end up with a mortgage commitment, but it's going to change some of the specs of what you have here, because now the mortgage is still going to be $400,000. The buyer's still going to be able to put down $100,000, assuming they qualify. But the problem now is your buyer is subject to mortgage insurance because they're only putting 10% down. And it's a completely different picture than what they may have subscribed to when they were intending to purchase the property. But the way that this contract is structured is it doesn't give any sort of protection to say, well, in the event it appraises low and mortgage insurance is now a requirement, the buyer would have flexibility. This contract doesn't say that. And that's why, if you've probably ever seen an attorney review letter from pretty much any attorney, and I include them in all of mine for buyers as well, is we like to put in appraisal contingencies. It essentially says if the property doesn't appraise at the purchase price, then we have some options. The buyer can always say, I'm okay with it where it is, I'll cover the difference, and we move forward. And in this market, I'm sure a lot of you are seeing that. And the seller's agents, when you have those, I'm sure you're trying to negotiate it because you're getting so many offers on properties. I'm finding people waiving appraisals or setting floors or covering differentials way more frequently now than ever before. The other option is that you can allow for the purchase price to be renegotiated. And this is the most common thing that happens in a normal market when a property underappraises. You send over the appraisal to the seller's agent and you say, we came in at 450, we're 50,000 light. You know, my clients would like to come down to 475, 480, or whatever it is your negotiation. But without adding some language to the contract that discusses that specifically, you don't have the benefit of that protection. The only protection your client has is whether or not they have the sufficient assets to still qualify for the mortgage. And so it may be an instance where they don't have an extra $50,000, and then it's not an issue. The lender can decline the mortgage because they won't qualify. But if they do have sufficient liquid assets, a lender is going to have to be bound to review their financials and can still say, I know you don't like it, but you qualify for a loan at 400,000. It's just going to cost you more out of pocket. So that's something that is probably often overlooked, and a lot of people may not know, is that just because it underappraises does not mean your buyer can A, get out of the contract, or B, renegotiate. So be very mindful of that when you're putting contracts together. And that's why you'll often see appraisal contingencies get added. Any questions, I guess, while we're discussing this? Anybody have any specific questions as to the appraisals, appraisal contingencies, things of that nature?
I guess the only one that I can think of is, so the mortgage company has to be obviously upfront about it. They can't be a friend saying, no, you can't afford it now.
Yeah, and that's the issue, and I've seen it many times. I will be frank, it depends on some lenders. Some lenders are much more willing to issue denial letters, and they just say, that's fine, I can deny you, no problem. Other lenders, they go through your financials and they'll say, I'm looking at what you've showed me. I can't deny you for this loan. And that's when you run into a problem. Now, if you have a buyer that is a VA loan, that never becomes a problem. If the property doesn't appraise in a VA loan, your mandatory clause 100% says the buyer has the right to terminate the contract. On an FHA loan, the same thing exists. That FHA mandatory clause says specifically, notwithstanding any other provision in this contract, if the property does not appraise for the purchase price, the buyer cannot be forced to proceed. Now, there are instances where with an FHA loan, a buyer can cover a difference. I have seen it. It doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. But a buyer cannot be made to cover the difference. And the reason is that FHA VA mandatory clause covers and protects 100% for any buyer that you have under these two types of loans. If they're buying conventional, that same protection does not exist. All right, so let me go back here.
Hey, Greg,
Yep.
I had a question.
Sure.
I know the FHA amenity clause, it has the value of the sale of the property, or should it have the value of the mortgage?
No, that's going to have the value of the sale of the property.
Right. Okay, that's how we see
the
it.
requirement. Yeah, the requirement under FHA and VA is that the property appraises for the purchase price. If it comes in light, that's when you have the ability to negotiate. And in all those instances, VA, you have zero wiggle room. If it doesn't appraise, there is no way that you can purchase the property at a purchase price above the appraised value. In an FHA loan, it's extremely rare that you'll see somebody purchase above but I have seen it on a very, very limited handful of times. I have somebody closing next week that's actually paying overvalue by $10,000 on an FHA, but they cannot be forced to waive it. It's even if you add something in the contract, and this is something that's been litigated, even if you added a provision of the contract that says a buyer is willing to cover $5,000 over appraisal on an FHA loan, the government required addendum actually supersedes any amendment you make to the contract and says, notwithstanding the provisions of this contract, you cannot be forced to buy it. So it's an interesting dichotomy that I've had arguments about in the past, where you have a property that a buyer says they'll cover additional over the appraisal, and then it underappraises and the seller tries to hold them to it. But then you go back to the FHA VA mandatory clause and it says, it doesn't really matter what you agree to, the government says you can't be forced to buy it. So it becomes a complete decision for the buyer in that instance.
Greg,
In the conventional, how is it protection sought? How do you have
So
the protection?
in a
Like,
conventional loan, the protection can be sought by either adding an appraisal contingency, which is the most common. And realistically, that's really the only guaranteed method to do it, because otherwise you're subject to whether or not a lender can and cannot approve. Absent an appraisal clause, there is some wiggle room. Now, if you have a 5% down conventional buyer, they can't buy 4% conventional. So then in that instance, they're, I mean, I guess the mortgage amount essentially serves as a bit of an appraisal contingency in very limited instances. But in most of the time, just because it underappraises, the question comes down to whether or not they qualify, unless you've made contract modifications.
Greg, I had a quick
Sure,
question.
Carrie.
You've said twice now that you can't be forced to, but if that VA buyer has funds and wants to, will the government give the loan?
I've never experienced a situation where a lender can issue if it's underappraised. In any instance, I believe that the lender must actually, the lenders are required to have the purchase price reduced down. So I don't believe you can get a VA loan for undervalue. I believe that's only possible with an FHA. At least I've yet to see it. And I've been doing this 16 years now. So
I think I had one, but I can't, I'm not sure of it, but
yeah, it would be, I'd be interested to hear about it, because I've had plenty of situations where I've had VAs underappraised, and it's just simply, we turn around and say, here's the appraisal.
right.
What do you guys want to do as a seller? And most instances, they just reduce it if it's not too drastic. There's always more flexibility for sellers. And that's why, I mean, frankly, if you have sellers, obviously cash is your best option because you're not subject to appraisals. And after that, conventional loans usually give you more flexibility. When you get into the realm of the VA FHA, not only are you subject to appraisal contingencies, but you're subject to much more in the way of possible repairs that show up on appraisals as well. And that always creates another item. I think hand raised, Ashley.
Hi,
Right.
I have a question about, the names, how you said getting the exact names. Can we legally as realtors obtain a copy of the front of their ID to ensure that that's correct?
Yeah, you can ask, so you could ask for that. What I would say is whatever side that you represent, you should ask them how they want to be taking title, because especially if you have a buyer, for example, how do they want to be on the deed? And I kind of indicated before that the process usually has already started with a lender, because most instances when you're making an offer on a property, they've gotten a pre-qualification. So they've probably submitted documentation to a lender. So I always recommend reach out to the lender. How is the documentation filled out in your system? Because ultimately, all of the documentation for closing is going to have to match up with what the lender has, because they're the ones that are starting first. In terms of sellers, you can just pull it right off the property record card. Whoever the owner is in the public records, copy that and put it on there. And again, it can always be amended, but those are kind of the foolproof ways to do it in most instances.
Greg, we have a question from Ashley.
Yep, Ashley just asked it.
Okay.
Thanks, James. All right, so moving forward onto other items that you're going to be able to fill in the contract. All right, as we scroll down, inclusions, exclusions. Now, this is one that I see many times. It'll just say as listed in the MLS. And as an attorney, I don't have as much access to things as you all do. So it's saying listed in the MLS always then makes me have to ask a question and say, can somebody please provide me with the MLS listing? Because I don't know what that means. I can see what's available on Zillow, Trulia, Realtor.com and those things. But if you have anything that's in the notes on a Bright listing or an MLS listing, I don't have that. Not to mention, and this is very important, the MLS listing is not a part of the contract. So, and I've had plenty of times where this is something that comes up is you'll have a seller who will say, it's close to closing and they've got a big screen television in the basement. One of these ones from the late 90s, early 2000s that weighs 200 pounds. And in their MLS, it said that the big screen TV was going to stay, but it doesn't list it anywhere as an inclusion in the contract. So we do a final walkthrough and there's a big screen TV in the basement. And my buyers say, we don't want that television. It's garbage to us. We got to get it out of here. Seller says, no. In my listing, I said it was going to stay. Well, it's not in the contract. So if it's not in the contract, that means it doesn't stay. Or if it's not in the contract as an exclusion, it means it's not excluded. So if you have something that's a fixture at the property and you intended to keep it, but you don't list it as an exclusion, it's not an exclusion. So I always recommend listing them out item by item. All the inclusions go in paragraph 6 right here. All the exclusions go in paragraph 7. If you want to reference the MLS, incorporate in this paragraph as stated in the MLS and attach the MLS listing to the contract and incorporate it as a part of the contract. Because absent that, we really don't have a good reference point as to what is and is not included. And unless you make a specific reference to the MLS, it's whatever was listed is always negotiable. I mean, plenty of times, especially with short properties, you'll see sellers willing to sell the property furnished. That doesn't mean that it's going to be furnished. That's still a negotiable term until it shows up in the contract or not in the contract. So be specific with those.
Greg, I have a question on that.
Sure.
I was told once not to necessarily say the seller is willing to leave the flat screen TV and willing to leave, a couch for the person that they're not selling. They're just willing to leave it. I was told that could be problematic with a mortgage company.
Great question, Laura. So things like that are kind of what we'll call personality. If you're going to list it in the contract, you have to indicate specifically that it has no monetary value, because otherwise the bank looks at it and says, well, wait a minute, we've got a purchase contract for 400,000 and you're leaving behind furniture. Well, that's part of the 400,000. So what is the property worth then? 398.5, 399. So you can always do things like that. I prefer to say, if you're going to leave behind tangible items like that. Now, let me back up. If you're talking about washer, dryer, refrigerator, things of that nature, that's all fine. Put those in inclusions. They're supposed to be expected to be in there. If you're talking tables, couches, lawn furniture, televisions, you can create a separate agreement. If I'm involved, I do it as what's called a bill of sale. And essentially you can sell it for $1 or whatever the parties negotiated. It just has to have at least a dollar of monetary value, and that creates a legally binding contract. That's an agreement between the parties. It's completely separate and apart from the contract of sale, but it's still legally binding. But you just indicate there that upon settlement, seller will sell the 2 couches, lawn furniture to buyer for $100. And then that's perfectly good. Bank doesn't care about it. They don't need to know about it. It's technically not part of the real estate transaction. That's a really good question, Laura.
Carrie, you had a question?
Yeah. Greg, do you like when people put as is condition following the appliances?
I don't necessarily have a problem with it. In fact, I think in a general commentary on as is, my opinion is if you're a seller and you're planning on not being really willing to negotiate repairs or specific things, come out and say it. Because one of my biggest frustrations representing a buyer is when we go through the process, we make changes in review, we do our inspection report, we send over 6 or 7 requests, and a seller responds saying, oh, this is an as-is sale. And we say, this is the first that we're hearing of this being as is. If you don't anticipate listening to requests, that's fine. I have no issue with that. But just be upfront about it, because I think it makes the negotiation be much more fair and honest, and you set the expectations better. So setting things as is with appliances, I have no problem with that whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is whether it's as is and working or as is and it doesn't work. So,
well, I mean, in that instance, here's the thing. If you know that something doesn't work, I think it should be disclosed. So if you say a dishwasher as is doesn't work,
but like ice maker doesn't work,
yeah,
or a knob is broken,
Yes, those types of things. I think if you're going to sell it as is because it's broken, disclose that it's broken, because otherwise you're going to set a buyer up and say, well, wait a minute, now we learned all of these appliances don't work and we didn't know it. That's $2,000, $4,000 I need for a new appliance package, or whatever it may be.
Right.
But otherwise, as is saying, look, it works. Maybe it's not perfect. It's scratched up. It's beat up, but it's functional. Then that's fine too. All right. Next section that you're going to be filling something in is certificate of occupancy here. As you can see, if you leave it blank, it's 1.5% of the purchase price. In most of our South Jersey towns, this really is not a huge issue unless you're selling in, for example, Pennsauken. Then it becomes an issue. If you're selling in a town that does a full-scale inspection for your CO, you want to make sure you do something here and be specific. Also, in those instances, if you have sellers, I recommend getting a really good idea for what's going to be involved in their potential CO investigation and inspection, because you don't want to have a process where you start it, you're 2 weeks before closing, you go to Pensacola and they fail you with a 30-item list. Seen it happen. I'm sure many of you have too. It's frustrating. It can add up. Ultimately, unless you're in an as-is sale or you're dealing with a contract or something like that, most of the time the seller's going to have to get the CO really regardless of what the cost is. I would recommend just kind of broaching that with your sellers up front. If it involves a smoke cert, you'll see down here, the cost to get the smoke detectors and those things is not considered a repair cost. So if you only have a smoke cert, and let's say you put $250 in here and it fails because the smoke detectors are all outdated and don't have the hard wire with the current batteries and they don't have a carbon monoxide, and it costs the seller $300 to get all that, they don't get to say no because that's not considered a repair cost. So that's just kind of a heads up. The repair cost is really if you have a full inspection CO where you have to do sidewalks in Cherry Hill or things like that. Those are repairs. These items listed here are not considered repairs. Here, just go back to my list again for a second. All right, next up, we've talked about this. So timelines. All right, so next up we have our timelines, and this is having to do with inspections. And we're going to go back through and talk a little bit more about the contents of some of these paragraphs in a few minutes. Most of the time, inspection periods are going to be 14 days. That's why it says it if you leave it blank. It's every once in a while, I see people put in 10 or even 7. The only one that I tend to like to shorten in inspections is response time. And I usually do this through a modification is we have 14 calendar days to do inspections, and then you're afforded 7 business days for a seller to respond, and then another 7 business days for a buyer to respond. So if you think about it, you could be upwards of 34 days in inspections based on the contract with everybody playing by the rules, which is an enormous amount of time. If you're trying to close in 30 to 45 days, you might actually bypass timeline just by everybody adhering to it. So while most people will try to negotiate in good faith and as fast as possible, and of course, while I understand that sometimes as a seller, you want to get some estimates before you commit to doing things, try to get responses out as soon as you can, and don't sit on reports if you don't need to. That being said, when I have buyers, I am a proponent of trying to send one request rather than here's one report and 5 things, and then another 2 days, here's another report with 2 more things, because I think that's unfair to sellers, because you're basically saying to the seller, oh, thanks for giving me a yes on that. I have 1 more day left on my inspection. Now I want to ask for more things. So to the extent you can, just be fair with the other side and tell them, here's where we are with our reports. Here's where my expectation is when I should have them to you with requests. And there's also nothing wrong with sending along an inspection report when you have it, saying, here's the report, we're reviewing it, and we're going to have a request for you in the next couple of days. That gives the seller the ability to get a leg up on doing their investigation, so they don't need 7 full business days to respond to you. All right. Let's see. Finally, you have your information that you're going to be putting as brokers. Obviously, you want to make sure you include all this information accurately. Make sure your commissions are correct. If you enter your commission in the agreement of sale, it's tough to convince the parties to modify it later. So make sure if you're 3%, put 3%. Don't put 2.5. Don't necessarily just leave it up to the MLS listing. Look out for yourselves and make sure you get paid what you deserve to get paid. Because like I said, if it's wrong up front and a seller sees that it's wrong, they might not be so agreeable to change it later because they feel like they're saving some money. So just double check that before you send a contract out and make sure that it's accurate. And then final section where you can input things is going to be checking some boxes for addendums, and then the all important paragraph 43. So we're going to get to paragraph 43 in a few minutes later. So what I want to move on to now is to talk a little bit about the mortgage contingency. So let me go back to here, outline. All right, so in most instances, buyers are obtaining mortgages to purchase property, and their purchase is contingent upon them obtaining that mortgage. So let's take a look then at the actual mortgage contingency language, because it is a bit of a discussion point, and I always find that it's a little bit ambiguous. So paragraph 3D talks about you getting a mortgage. Up top here, we talk about the type of loan. We've gone over this. The area that I want to direct you to essentially says here, and this is a date we're going to input for when you're going to have your mortgage. If it's left blank, it's 30 days. something I did fail to mention when I was going through is try not to set your clients up to fail in the mortgage contingency. If you give them 2 weeks to get a mortgage, it's really not fair to the lender and it's not fair to your buyers. It's tough to do. It's tough to get an appraisal done, processed, and a loan cleared within 14 days. Even though I understand that you're trying to market your buyer as much as possible to a seller for a fast closing, setting it too short could actually result in it being detrimental to them in the long run. So coordinate with the lender, make sure the lender is okay with whatever date that you choose. Now, after the time period is set here, you're working on getting your commitment. In the event the commitment is not delivered on time, this is the section that then comes into play. The buyer has not obtained the commitment. Either the buyer or the seller may void this contract by written notice to the other party within 10 calendar days of the commitment date or any extension thereof. So what this says is, let's say that we have March 5th as our date for commitment. If the commitment does not come by 11:59 p.m. on the 5th, either party can cancel the contract during the next 10-day period. There's no indication that a reason needs to be given. So on my outline, I indicated that this could be an escape clause or it could be a deal killer. There's different ways that this can work depending if you have the buyer or the seller. So let's talk about buyer first. If you have a buyer and let's say you have a 30-day mortgage commitment range, you've gone through your inspections and some things came up and you've reached an agreement because there were certain things that weren't necessarily defective, but the buyer's just generally not happy with the contract, not happy with the property and is looking for a way out. Well, if they're if they've provided documentation to their lender and they're actively processing their loan, on day 31, they have the right to cancel the contract and can get out of it, get their deposit back without giving a reason, simply by saying, I haven't received my mortgage commitment yet. And again, this is dependent 30 days. It could be, it's whatever the date that ends up getting plugged in this section is. So it could be 20 days, 19 days, whatever it is you input. The only thing that you have to make sure is to make sure that your buyers have been doing the things they're supposed to do and that the lender can say with certainty that they've pursued their mortgage, they've given us everything we need. In that instance, it does give your buyers essentially an escape clause to a contract that they've changed their mind on without penalty. On the flip side, however, you have a seller who took your client's offer, and then since then, other offers came in and they were at a return review and they've got a cash buyer that's $30,000 higher. And you know that that seller is itching to try to get out of this contract. You went through inspections and they said no to everything. Your buyers still really want the property. I can tell you that that seller, if they're savvy, is looking at that mortgage commitment date and they are waiting for that to expire. And if they have not gotten their mortgage commitment, you are going to get a letter that following morning or even right after midnight that says the contract is canceled. We didn't get your mortgage commitment. Here's your deposit back. We're moving on to another offer. So it is really important to keep an eye on this deadline because it can burn you if you don't provide it. Now, in most transactions, I mean, this is one of the oft forgotten things is, oh, where's the status of our mortgage? We're not closing for another 30 days. Do you happen to have it? And everybody plays nice and it's really usually not a big deal. But in those instances, like I just described, it can be a big deal. So make sure that you set something that's realistic and make sure you keep an eye on that deadline. If you know 7 to 10 days out that you're not going to hit your commitment date, ask for an extension if you have a buyer and they want this property. Better to be protected. Don't allow it to float into this 10-day period. Now, here's the question that I always kind of theoretically pose is, this contract does not talk about what happens 11 days after the commitment date. It gives you 10 days to cancel, but it doesn't say what happens if you don't cancel within those 10 days. And this is where, frankly, I think there's a big ambiguity in the contract that's not really addressed. For a buyer, if you haven't provided a commitment, your purchase is still contingent on you getting that mortgage. So whether it's day 11, 12, 15, you don't necessarily, according to this, have the right to just blankly cancel. But if your lender gives you a mortgage denial, you still get out, you get your deposit back because you didn't get a mortgage. It just doesn't say what happens with the seller. If the seller starts demanding a commitment and day 11 comes, this doesn't say yes or no that the seller can cancel. Again, it's an ambiguity. And I think until somebody eventually fights it out and a judge determines what it really means, I can't give you a concrete answer. But to me, if you miss the mortgage commitment deadline, it seems as if it's open-ended enough that realistically, if you want to get out, you can get out as long as you've, as a buyer, diligently pursued your mortgage, or as a seller, if you give written notice. So kind of an important item to always be mindful of. Any questions on mortgage commitments?
Yeah, Greg, so in the attorney review letter, do you address this and say, you know, that if the buyer doesn't get their mortgage commitment, well, I'm trying to see how I can phrase this. you just said the ambiguity there. Do you, in your attorney review letter, do you fix that at all in the letter?
It's a great question. So it depends.
Okay.
In some instances, like in this market, for example, if I have a buyer, and the first thing I'll always look to do is I look to extend the deadlines as long as I can. If I have a buyer that's, we'll have a conversation. We've been looking for 6 months. This is the first house we found. We love this house. We're going to do inspections. If we can get some things in inspections, that would be fantastic, but we don't want to lose this house. I'll look at the contract. I'll look at our closing date. I'll look at where we are. I'll see who the lender is, which is also incredibly important. And I'll say, you know what? I think we're a little tight on time here. I'm going to automatically extend your mortgage commitment deadline in the contract right now. I'm going to move it from March 26th to April 5th because we're closing on April 12th, and that'll give us time. Another thing that I'll often do is I'll either remove reference to automatic waivers or remove reference to, or add in and say, in the event that the buyer provides regular updates, that the mortgage commitment date will be automatically extended until either party provides basically a time of the essence on it. So that's another option. Aside from that, those are really the ways that I do it on a buyer. On a seller side, there's not really a whole lot that I do because I like to have my sellers to have flexibility. So the shorter the date for the sellers to some extent in a buyer's, in this type of market. Now, if we're in a flip side market where there are a million properties on the market and there are not many buyers, if I'm a seller, I want to remove the right for the buyer to be able to cancel the contract. And in fact, in almost any instance with a seller, I do this, is I say a buyer can't just cancel the contract unless they have a mortgage denial. And that takes away the buyer sitting on their hands and giving one document a day to the lender and saying, I changed my mind. And so in that instance, if they can't provide me with a mortgage denial, you're not out, because then you just haven't done what you needed to do. You work it out with your lender. I allow my sellers to retain the right to cancel so that they're not stuck sitting around waiting while the buyer takes forever. One other thing that I do in every instance where I represent a seller is I look to expedite the appraisal, because I think the appraisal is what causes a big problem. And so I'll insert either 3 to 5 business days following the conclusion of attorney review. The buyer must authorize its lender to order the appraisal. And this often gets misinterpreted because people will always, I get a lot of response saying, we can't control when the lender is going to order the appraisal. I'm not asking you to. I'm very clear that I want you to write to your lender and say, charge my credit card. Charge me the $450, go schedule the appraisal, because the last thing that I want to see, especially with an FHA or VA transaction, is we do the inspections, my seller agrees to repair $3,000 worth of things, and then 2 days later, the appraisal comes back and there's peeling paint, and I need handrails, and I need something else, and it's another $1,500 worth of things after we've already agreed on repairs. And I think it's unfair to the seller because now they've negotiated in good faith, and then the appraisal comes back and they're stuck with more repairs. And ultimately you say, well, look, we agreed to $3,000 in credit. We want to back that up since now we have to do this. And the buyer says, no, we already signed the addendum. If you want to sell to me, I need these repairs done because it's a VA or FHA, and the seller's in a bad spot. So I think it's kind of a different perspective on who you have, the type of protection that you want to put in place. All right. So,
Okay, don't leave a cliffhanger there. What
was that?
What happens? I mean, the cliffhanger is what you just left. Is the situation is the lender, if FHA is requiring these repairs to be done, what happens? You've already agreed, and they've said it's as is property, but the lender says, hey, these things have to be taken care of in order for the person to get the loan. Does the buyer, do you do it for escrow or something, adjust the price? What happens?
So you're not going to be able to do an escrow, because in the instance that something comes up on an appraisal requirement, it has to be finalized and corrected before closing. The appraiser has to then either go back out in person and see it, or sometimes they'll accept photographs, and they have to sign off on it as being a corrected condition in order for the loan to be funded. So your options at that point, it's just like everything else in this business, it's still a negotiation to an extent. In a lot of instances, the sellers will say, fine, I'll take care of it. In some instances, buyers will say, it's peeling paint. I'm free on Saturday. Do you mind if I come out and scrape your shed and paint it myself? Sure, sounds good. Sometimes people allow that. I've had other instances where I've had a seller, actually, we're closing on Friday. They had negotiated some things, and part of the request, because we forced the appraisal up front, was that certain things had to be done for the appraisal. So we knew what was required for the CO, and we knew what was required under the inspection, and we knew it was required under the appraisal. So my client took a look at everything, we discussed it, and we said, look, we're willing to give you a credit of $3,000 for everything. As it relates to the items for the appraisal, it's going to cost $1,200 for those items to be done. You can either do them, or we'll do them, or we're going to deduct $1,200 from our offered credit. So we'll give you $1,800, and I'm going to have a contractor go out and do these things. Or I'll give you $3,000, and you can feel free to come on over to the house and take care of these things yourself. That's your choice. You're going to sign a waiver saying you can't sue me if you get hurt on the property or anything like that. And then that's how we can work it out. So just like everything else, working constructively to try to solve the problem, especially if you have a situation where a buyer wants to buy and a seller wants to sell, you can make it work. Sometimes you just have to think outside the box a little bit. All right, so next, let's talk about time of the essence. So,
Greg,
yes.
before you move on, in the section D where it says the principal amount and the mortgage, if it doesn't appraise at that point, how you said with conventional that you can't back out. Now, I had another attorney tell me that this will hold up for the conventional appraisal because the principal amount and all that changes.
So that's the question, is sometimes it doesn't though. And so the example that Jim had given before was a $500,000 purchase with a $400,000 mortgage. So the question then becomes is, can the buyer still get that mortgage? Now, if you have, let's bring it down for like easier to talk about numbers. Let's say you have a $100,000 purchase and a $95,000 mortgage. Okay, in that instance, buyer's putting down $5,000. They're taking out a mortgage at 5% down, 95% mortgage. If the property appraises at that point at $95,000, you have a built-in appraisal contingency because they can't finance $95,000 at that point. And so in that instance, they can't get a mortgage for $95,000. So with that, you kind of have a de facto mortgage contingency. If, however, in the example that Jim had given before, if you have a buyer that's putting 20% down, a lender might look at their finances and say, well, you have $600,000 in your bank accounts. I know you can cover that difference. Your credit score is 830. I can give you a mortgage of $400,000 on a $450,000 property. It's now only 90% financed. So you're going to get some PMI, but I can give you that mortgage. And so in that instance, the numbers don't change. So going back to the contract here, in that instance, the purchase price would stay at $500,000. Their down payment still remains 100 because they're financing 400 still. It's just the terms of their loan changed. So that's where it really is property specific and amount specific as to whether or not those numbers change. But I do agree with you. If the mortgage amount has to change and the down payment has to change, then yes, you're not forced to proceed because you'd have to amend the contract to change it. It's in those instances where you have sometimes overqualified or really well qualified buyers. They kind of get the short end on the appraisal reduction if it's a minimal appraisal reduction and their mortgage doesn't change.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. All right, so we were just going to
Just kind of highlight there, Greg, and I'm sure Julie can remember this occasion. There's a lot of contracts that look like this, but are not this, so read them.
We're going to talk about that in a bit too. That's a good one. All right.
Greg remembers that one very well too.
I remember, I've seen that particular contract more times than I care to count. So let's talk for a minute about time of the essence. So paragraph 8 specifically talks about dates and time for performance. Now, this is essentially saying that if you put a date in a contract, the date matters. And we're all South Jersey, you're all South Jersey agents, I'm a South Jersey attorney, so I tend to agree with you. If there's a date in the contract, that date matters. Once you get above the Princeton, Trenton, I guess the I-195 line, they don't think that the date matters anymore. You're going to get a letter from an attorney. It's probably going to be 4 or 5 pages long. I'm sure many of you have seen them. They have 30 paragraphs. They like to restate things that are in the contract already and use their words that make it look like they're doing a lot of work, and good for them. And they're going to try to take out time of the essence. And really what that means is, we'll close when we get around to it. We'll send stuff over to you when we get around to it. And that can become frustrating in some instances. In other instances, it's okay. So what do I mean by this? So you have a closing date. If we scroll back up to section 3, you can see your closing date is the balance of the purchase price is due on this date right here. In North Jersey, or some limited South Jersey attorneys, they'll remove this and say, here's our closing date, but this date is not of the essence. That means whenever we get around to closing is fine, but you can always institute time of the essence by sending me a letter that says in 10 days, we have to close this property, otherwise you'll have issues. Why they do that up there is they kind of just turn things over to the lender gets things processed and says, all right, now we're ready to go. And then they start talking about scheduling. You run into problems with this a lot of times, especially if you have a chain deal. If you have a buyer who is selling their house in the morning, buying in the afternoon, and then their seller is buying later in the day, you have to be really mindful to make sure that you have everybody on the same page. If a couple contracts don't have time of the essence and one does, you start to run into problems. Now, I know you'll have property sale contingencies in some of these, but things start to bleed. The other problem is you have a lack of sense of urgency. And this I see all the time when it's a North Jersey deal, is I have a seller who's ready to go and the buyer's just not quite ready. They're just not quite ready. They don't give you a lot of updates and things start to slide. So most of you probably dealing down south haven't had to experience it too many times. But the good thing about time of the essence is it keeps it on schedule. The bad thing about time of the essence is if you're running behind, you're behind and it could result in a breach or it could result in your client losing out on a property. Now there's one exception that the contract does build in, and that's this section down here at the end of this paragraph that talks about 3 business days per the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So when we had the market crash dip in the late aughts, it used to not have CDs that had to be disclosed 3 days before closing. It used to just be, we get to closing and the numbers are ready, we just go and we're ready to go. But now, as you all know, we have to have a closing disclosure sent over to your buyer 3 days before closing, and everything on that discloses all the lender's fees, and we get coordinated with our title company. And then yes, the final numbers oftentimes don't come out until 2 days, 1 day before closing, but all the fees from the lender have been disclosed. With this protection that's implemented in that section I just showed you, and I'll show you again here, as long as the lender issues their CD on or before the date of closing in your contract, the contract automatically allows for a 3 business day extension. And so this is something that's often overlooked. So even if you have a time of the essence contract, as long as your lender is disclosed by the closing date, you have an automatic 3-day buffer, business day buffer for your buyer, where the seller can't say you're in breach, seller can't walk away. Technically, you don't even need an addendum to the contract unless your specific lender wants it, because the contract already contemplates for this 3-day extension because there's a lender that needs to get things done, as long as it's of no fault or buyer seller. So if your buyer's done everything that he or she needs to do and the lender's just running behind, they get that CD out on Friday, you can still close by Wednesday and you're good to go. All right. So aside from that, this contract means every deadline means what it means. Importantly, that applies to your inspection provision as well. And this is one that comes up every so often. You have 14 days to conduct your inspections. Within 14 days after the inspections are completed, you're required to submit. If any physical defects are identified, you're required to submit your list of repairs to the other side within that 14-day paragraph. All right. If you don't do so, this clause is deemed waived by the buyer. So that's the other big time of the essence clause that's contained in the contract, is your inspection contingency. If you miss your 14 days and you have not gotten an extension and you send over those repair requests, the other side is well within its rights to say, sorry, we don't agree to anything and there's nothing you can do about it because you didn't send it to us on time. So the pluses of removing time of the essence is it basically makes it where you cannot make a mistake that you can't kind of correct time-wise. The downside of time of the essence is it can allow contracts to drag out indefinitely unless you start to institute resume time of the essence, but that's a 10-day period unless it's been otherwise defined. So like I said, most of you have probably not experienced too much with having it removed, but it's just something to kind of take a look at, read those sections over and become comfortable with them so you can understand exactly what's involved. All right. Next up, yep.
I'm sorry, as you're talking to that, I'm going back to the lender requiring repairs.
Mhm.
What is there anything there with time of essence, and how's that all play out there?
So if you have a lender required repair, it's going to come up as a part of your appraisal. So on the appraisal report, you're going to see the comps that are used. You're going to see the value that the appraiser determined the home to be worth. And then there'll be a section that'll say, in addition, the following need to be corrected in order for the loan to be funded. And so in that instance, your closing date still remains. And as I said, with how these get paid or how these get done, it does still remain a negotiation point. And so one of the reasons that if I have a seller, I like to also request that that appraisal get done right away is I'm not getting an appraisal 3 days before closing that say there's 5 things that need to be done, which now means everybody's scrambling or makes it impossible. So if you're able to do that early, usually you have time to get it worked out. If not, there are instances where frankly, you're going to say, all right, we've got the appraisal, we're willing to take care of it, but we need to extend the closing date in order to allow that to happen. And so that's the conversation that you have to have there. So again, it's all negotiable. There's not a drop dead date, but realistically, what would amount to if it's not done, the lender is going to issue you a denial because they cannot fund the loan until those repairs are completed. And then you end up with a mortgage denial, and then the contract falls apart, and you go on your way.
If the seller has already put in the contract, no extensions will be honored. Does that apply to the situation where we can't get the property? We come up to closing, we don't have time to get everything done. Is it bad on the buyer side when he wants still the property, but the lender is requiring these repairs, but the seller has in the contract no extensions of the contract, no extensions of any kind?
So the ultimately, if the seller doesn't want to agree to an extension, the seller does not have to agree to an extension, but it means you're not going to get a loan and you're not going to sell your house. So a lot of these things end up with conversations of let's be practical and talk about what does this really mean. Now, I know that there are some flippers and there's banks that talk about what happens in these instances. So if you're buying an REO and it says we're not going to grant an extension, well, in the event you're buying an REO, most of the time the bank's not going to agree to do anything anyway. And so if you're representing a buyer who's buying a foreclosure property and they're looking to go FHA or VA, be careful because you're setting yourself up for difficulty already, because a lot of times these foreclosure properties need work. And if you're buying FHA or VA, it's not always the best type of loan to go in there because you're setting it up to say, all right, we got the appraisal back. Now I have to go and I'm going to have to make repairs, because a lot of times that's going to come up and the seller's not going to agree to do it in most instances. And so then either you wasted your time by doing inspections and spending money on a deal that can't happen, or your buyers or sellers are asking for permission to send contractors over to do the work themselves, and then they're undertaking even more. So if the sellers are hard and fast on a deadline, what that ultimately means is you have to pose it to them, look, if you want to sell me the property, here's what needs to get done and we need an extension to do it. If you're not willing to do that, then we're going to get a mortgage denial. I'm going to get my deposit back anyway, and you just wasted this much time off the market. So you either get this done in a week, or you can relist and sell in 30 days. Do the math. It's kind of a no-brainer.
One last thing, Greg, in the situation here. In the process of appraisal comes in, and the seller has agreed to give the buyer a seller's concession of a certain value. After the appraisal comes in, that they want to bump us. They get $5,000, so they get $5,000 back for closing costs. That's okay, and there's no problem there. I mean, normally you can have that just put the price in, $5,000 above, and when it comes in, it appraises, they get it. But after the fact, and even with that situation, do you have to show the seller the appraised value so that he will do it?
So here's when it comes to the appraisal is the buyer's property. The buyer can do with the appraisal what they want to do. That said, if you're a buyer and you want to ask for a price reduction, you're going to need to show the appraisal to show why you're asking for the price reduction. So in that instance, you need to provide it. If there are repairs required, you're going to have to show that the appraiser wanted repairs required. And I've had this once before where I had another attorney only kept sending me the page that had the appraisal requirement, the repairs in it. I said, that's all well and good, but I need to see the whole appraisal. That one page to me is not an appraisal. I need to make sure that it corresponds. I want to see exactly what's in there. I want to see exactly what it ties to, send it over. And the reason that they didn't want to show me is what I figured is it appraised over value, but it needed repairs. So they were trying to keep the price, get the seller to pay for the repairs, and make out both ways. If you have somebody that's demanding that you do things in relation to an appraisal and you have a seller, get the appraisal report and demand it and say, we're not doing anything and you haven't proven anything to me until you send me that report. Carrie, you're muted.
You can't assume that because something under appraises by, say, $5,000 and there was a $5,000 seller concession, that you can just take the seller concession out, correct? It's the,
No, you
they
cannot,
still
because
might really need it, and
that's correct.
and it was part of the contract and it has to stay in.
Correct. So that's a negotiation. Now,
Right.
that's good. I guess I didn't address that half of the question. So
Okay.
a lot of times I'll see FHA buyers and they go under contract and their lender tells them, all right, your closing costs are going to be $7,200 approximately. Based on what you need a $4,000 credit for me to give you this loan. At this purchase price with your finances, you need $4,000 back. Otherwise, your debt to income doesn't line up and I can't fund the loan for you.
Right.
So you go under contract, it's $150,000 is the purchase price. We're going to build it into 154 with 4 back. And then in your example, let's say it appraises at 150. It's not an automatic reduction. The only time it becomes an automatic reduction is if you add something to contract that says,
That's that.
in the event the property appraises for less than the purchase price, but equal or greater to 150, in that instance, we'll erode the credit in like amount of the reduction of whatever the purchase price has to be to line it up. So if it appraises at 152, now we're at 152 and 2 back. But aside from making that specification, they are separate terms. The purchase price is X, the credit is Y. If the purchase price comes in low, it becomes a negotiation point, and if the buyer can still qualify and agree to it, that's fine. You can make that work and you can do whatever you guys all agree to. But if the buyer says, I can't close this without 4,000, I'm going to get a mortgage denial, well, then the seller's left with a decision. You can either say no thanks, relist and find another buyer, or you can reduce it, make the seller's concession stay the same, the purchase price gets reduced, and away you go.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I think I think what I asked for got twisted a little bit. The situation is the home is on the contract for 215.
Mhm.
The seller has said that he did not want to do a concession of 5 and bump it up to 220.
Mhm.
Okay, the sales price. He wants to wait till the appraisal comes in to see if it meets the 220 to give the 5,000 back. See, he nets the same 215,000.
Mhm.
It's not the other way around.
No, I understand.
Okay,
There's a risk to doing it that way because, as many of you have probably seen, it's amazing to me how many times the appraised value is exactly the same as the purchase price. You guys are so good at pricing out homes that it amazes me how it always seems to work out that way. So if you're looking to build in a concession, I typically recommend you do it up front if you know that's the way you're going to go, because if he prices it at 215 and it goes under contract, 80% of the time it's going to come in at 215, maybe 10% of the time it's going to come in low and 10% of the time it's going to come in high. But if you wait on that concession, you're probably missing a good chance to actually have it come in there. Because remember, the appraiser has your contract. They know what the property is under contract for. So it's not an accident that it always comes in, or that it often comes in right at or around the sale price.
Totally agree.
So, and remember, you can negotiating credits, and we're going to talk about repairs in a minute. You can negotiate a seller's credit at any point in time up to that 3-day window before closing, because it can be for any reason whatsoever. It can be, and you're never going to specify anything other than closing costs. So lender doesn't know, lender doesn't care. It can be because somebody decided, I've seen people reduce commissions and then they change it as a credit. I've seen people do it for repairs. I've seen people do it for, hey, I'm going to sell you something, but I'm going to give you as a credit. We're going to work something out, or we're going to do a rent back and I'll give you a concession. You let me stay in the property for an extra 2 weeks. Doesn't matter what the reason is. Doesn't matter the timing. As long as you have that to the lender 3 days before closing, you'll be all right. Okay. All right. Next. So let's move on, and we're going to talk a little bit about representations that sellers make in a contract. Okay, sure. So okay, so can you all see, am I sharing the right thing? I hit something on my computer. I think I messed it up.
Yeah, sharing your outline.
Okay, good. Just want to make sure. All right, so we're going to talk about representations the sellers make. In the contract of sale, there is no specific provision that talks about permits. There is a provision that talks about what the home is zoned as. And what did I hit? Sorry, I hit something on my computer. There we go. It shrunk my Zoom. All right, so if we go to this section of the contract here, there is a comment about what the home is zoned as, and it should say single. I'm gonna go way up. Sorry, I scrolled down too far there. So you're going to input that the property is zoned as a single family residential dwelling or whatever kind of property it is. But there is an indication here that it says that things are compliant with the township and things like that, but there's not a specific reference as it relates to permits. So one thing that I do anytime I represent a buyer is I always include a provision that indicates that the seller is representing that he or she has obtained all permits related to the property and that they'll provide whatever permits are in their possession. And in the event that the inspection of the property reveals that something was upgraded and done that required a permit and didn't have the necessary permit, that the seller will either obtain that permit or the buyer retains the right to walk away from the contract. There are a couple towns in New Jersey that do have requirements that you get a letter that says that everything's up to snuff in terms of permits. Those are kind of a little bit more up north. There's a few others. But there's nothing that aside from going and actually doing an Open Public Record Act request that'll give you any idea as to whether or not the sellers have obtained permits for things. So one thing I do like to do is I request an OPRA through the town, which you can just do online. You go on their website, print it out, send it in, and they'll send you back all the permits that have existed for the property. And then from there, what you can do is you give that to your home inspector, you bring it to the home inspection, you can compare it to the report. If you see there's a hot water heater that was installed in 2018, but no corresponding permit, well, then you know that there is something that you may need to approach the seller about and say, hey, you got a hot water heater you didn't permit, we'd like you to permit it. The contract doesn't make any other specific representations as to this, and it's kind of a little bit of a hole that buyers can get stuck if they don't ask the right questions. Now, the contract does allow for an addendum to disclose HOA fees, and you've all seen the addendum that adds in where you add in the property management company or the contact for the HOA, what the current fees are, and it says in there that the seller is responsible for obtaining the HOA letter. Two things that I want to discuss on that just real briefly is one, when you're inputting the information about the HOA fees, double check to make sure they're right, because if you put in something that's an annual fee as the monthly fee, it throws the other side's calculations all off, and then you find out about it at the end, and it can really ruin a deal if things are either under or over disclosed. The other thing is if you have a seller who is selling a property in North Jersey and they have an HOA, North Jersey attorneys take the position that the buyers should obtain the HOA documents and dues letter. This always boggles my mind because the buyer has no connection with the association. The buyer has no ability to really contact the association, and the seller is a member of the HOA. So if you have one of these contracts, remember in your addendum, it says it's the seller's responsibility. Don't let the attorney for the seller, if you have an up north attorney, put that obligation on you as a buyer, because it's something that your buyer shouldn't have to do. If you have a man, like an associate or Target Property Management, where you have to go and you have to pay $150 to get the letter, they're trying to fee shift that burden onto your client to spend money for a property that ultimately they may end up not buying it, and now they just spent money on an HOA package that they don't have any need for. So just keep an eye on that. And then the other item that I want to talk about in representations is with regard to tenancies. And so I'm going to go back to the contract here and go to paragraph 12. So in paragraph 12 of the contract, it talks about whether or not there's a tenant at the property. Almost all instances, this box is going to be checked. The sellers live in the property or it's vacant. In some instances, this is going to be checked. They're going to disclose to you and put all the tenant information here. Make sure that this is accurate. If you do have a tenant in the property, you want to make sure that you have a copy of the current lease. You want to make sure that you have a rent roll. What that means is, what's the history of rent for this particular tenant? Have they paid on time? When have they paid? Do they have any balance? You want to get all of that information to make sure that you're buying a property where the seller is properly disclosing and that the tenant is current. You want to find out, do you have a security deposit? Where is that security deposit? Is it in an escrow account? Did they disclose to the tenant where that security deposit is? Because if they haven't done those things, that tenant might have a claim for some money or for some things that they can do. And you don't want to start off in a bad spot if you're taking over a tenant occupied property. The other thing is, if you have a tenant in the property, make sure you discuss with your client that they know what's involved in that. Landlord-tenant laws in this state, as I'm sure you know, are very, very, very tenant protective. It's the most tenant protective state in the country. Just because there's a lease, and this is the one I want to stress the most. You have a buyer who's buying a property. The seller tells you, the lease is up on May 31st. You guys will be great. We're going to close on June 1st. The tenant will be out. You'll have no problems. Just because the lease says it's up on May 31st doesn't mean the lease is up on May 31st in the state of New Jersey. Leases are indefinite in New Jersey unless they are terminated by one of a couple of legal methods. One is a tenant saying, I've given notice, I'm vacating the property, I will be out by May 31st, and acknowledging that possession is going to be returned to the seller. That's one. Number two is an eviction order with a execution by the sheriff where they actually remove somebody. Number three is if you're a landlord and you send notice of changes to the contract at least 60 days before the end of the term of the lease, and the tenant rejects those changes, at that point you can terminate the lease. Other than that, the only other method that a landlord can terminate a lease is if there's a default under the terms of the lease, and again, they have to get a court order, or if they're going to be moving into the property as the owner, or if they go under contract to sell a property to somebody and it states in the contract of sale, the buyer will be occupying the property. In that instance, you can give a tenant 60 days notice and they have to vacate. Now, the key thing, one second, Carrie, I'll get to you, is one thing to keep note is right now is there is still a moratorium on evictions. And so if you're buying a property that has a tenant, and even if they say they're going to get out, make sure that you know what's going on, because if that tenant doesn't leave, you're not getting them out anytime soon. The backlog is going, from what I hear from landlord tenant attorneys, is going to be crazy once the courts open back up, because there are so many evictions that are waiting to be filed that can't be filed. And so there's going to be a long time before the sheriffs are going to be getting anybody out of a property. So if you're buying a tenant occupied property, make sure that, number one, if you're doing it under an FHA or VA loan, that 60-day occupancy requirement could become a real big issue. So make sure that you have protections in place there. Otherwise, there's certain steps that you need to take. Carrie. Mute.
Make sure I get your phone number and address in this box.
Do we need an estoppel certificate for any of this?
So one of the things that you should receive at settlement is a tenant estoppel letter. And what that is, it's a written certification from the landlord that says this lease is still in effect. The tenant is in good standing. I have received all rent through the date that I've signed this estoppel. I'm in possession of a security deposit in this amount located that I'm in this account, and I'm going to be turning it over to you at closing. And here's a copy of my lease. That gives you the ability to go back after the landlord if there's any misrepresentation following closing. So yeah, and it's nothing, there's not a formal form. It can be, there's not like one document. It's not like a DocuSign or an NJAR form.
Okay.
It's just kind of a letter that every attorney has a version of their own. It just gives you the information.
Okay.
So yeah, that is something that you want to get, and it confirms all those items that I just kind of went through. One other thing to keep in mind, and this is something that's particularly pertinent down the shore. The section here, I'm going to share again, says right here that the property is not currently occupied. Possession and occupancy will given the buyer closing should be entitled to the property. This is only disclosing whether or not it's subject to tenancies at the current time. This section of the contract does not talk about the owner of the property renting the property there on out. So what I see all the time, and one of the changes I always make, I make it on any property, but down the shore, I'm very explicit about it, is if you're going under contract to buy a property that's down the shore and you're closing in late July and you go under contract in May, make sure that if your clients are buying this as a house they want to occupy, put something in that contract that prevents the owner from renting it out to anybody new between the time the contract is signed and the time of closing. Because if they put somebody else in there during that time and they're making money, $4,000 a week or whatever it is, that's great for them. But if your clients aren't okay with it, number one, it subjects the house to additional wear and tear. It may happen after your inspection, and now all of a sudden you go to do a walkthrough and there's been 7 more tenants in the property and the house is beaten up and it's not what they expected. Or number two, they go to close and all of a sudden you find out that the house is rented for the rest of the summer and they're not able to get access until the end of August because there's an active lease. That's a problem because the contract doesn't say that they're not going to rent it out anymore. So like I said, it's usually more of an issue down the shore. Just be mindful of it. Don't let anybody put another person in that house unless your clients are okay with it. And if they're okay with it, let's say they're buying it as an investment property to rent, one of the things I'll always then put in is Before the seller can enter into any lease agreements, the proposed lease agreement and information about the tenant has to be presented to my client, and they have to sign off on it and accept that person as a tenant as well. All right.
A question with
Sure,
regard
Kate.
to the deposit.
Yes.
I have the deposit of my tenant in a bank.
Mhm.
Before closing, do I have to terminate that account and then?
No, so what you'll typically do is at closing, it can be one of two ways. If you have a cash buyer, you just put it on the sheet. It'll be security deposit turnover. It'll go from seller to buyer. If you have a lender involved, what you'll do is you'll cut a check from that account, certified funds, bring it to closing, and you'll hand that to the buyer and say, these are the security deposit funds. You'll have them sign something saying they accepted the security deposit funds. As soon as that then is done, then you can close out your account. Because that'll be the proof that everything was then turned in. You're going to want to keep that for the last statement though, because it'll show the security deposit plus any of the interest that accumulated. And just remember that interest is the possession of the tenant. So you have to also pay that interest out as well.
Thanks.
Okay. All right. So
If the landlord says it's not an interest bearing account, do you have to prove that, or just,
so all escrow accounts for security deposits per New Jersey statute are supposed to be interest bearing. They have to put them in a specific type of account. Now, granted, right now you're talking probably pennies on the dollar for each year, but it is supposed to be an escrow, an interest bearing account.
okay, because we were told it's not in an interest bearing account.
Yeah, it's supposed to be. That's what because you're basically what you're doing with the security deposit. You're taking a tenant's money and you're holding it, but it's still their money even while it's in a security deposit account. So they're able to make some money off of it. So you should push back for that. You're entitled to basically statutory interest for it if not.
Yeah, and I think the tenant's also supposed to get that interest
You're supposed to
every
tender at the
year.
end of each year annually. You're either supposed to tender them a check with the interest, or you can credit it to their rent. If you just have to disclose to them what the amount is, or they can say that's fine, just leave it in there and give it to me at the end. But you're supposed to disclose that to them, correct?
And if the lease is just expired and keeps on going further on out.
Yeah,
month to
same
month
thing. If it keeps getting renewed, again, you can either give them a check for 17 cents or whatever it may be, or you can roll it over to the following year. Just give them an update at the end of each term to say, here's what's in your account. Let me know what you want me to do with the interest, and then you're covered. All right, so let's move on to inspections. All right, this is obviously one of the most contentious sections of a transaction. So let's go here. So the inspections begin, paragraph 13 talks about lead-based paint. If your home is older than 1978, you're going to check applicable. It's pretty rare that these types of inspections are done. I've had a few of them over the years, obviously, but in most instances, what I recommend to my clients is have your home inspection, have your home inspector take a look at the property. And if there's something that the home inspector picks up that might be an issue with lead-based paint, they'll alert you and say, you might want to get this taken, take a look at this. In most instances, the homes that have been painted again and again and again, even if there's lead-based paint, it doesn't even show up on a test. And so I would imagine most of you probably haven't encountered much in the way of significant issues with lead-based paint. If you do, you probably have the odd story that most people don't encounter. So with lead-based paint, it's usually not something that's done all that often. Next, let me share again here. Next is going to be another one that I wouldn't imagine you're going to run into very often is a point of entry treatment system. These are essentially extinct in New Jersey. There's a few of them around. They're not allowed to be here anymore. If you have one of these, you would know it. If you have one, you're going to want to have your client retain an attorney, I would say, in almost any situation. Same thing with the cesspool. These are the outdated forms of either water treatment or private sewage disposal methods. They're not used any longer in New Jersey. If you have a cesspool, you'll see that there are two options you need to check. Either number one, the seller is going to remove the cesspool prior to closing, or either number two, the buyer is going to agree to immediately remove it after closing. In no instance can that home be sold with a cesspool and it just continue to meander along in its current form. It has to be taken out and has to be converted to either tied into public sewer or converted to private septic. Again, the chances of you running into one of these things is extremely rare. They're very, very few and far between. So then we talk about the home inspection. So the home inspection, all right, the buyer is technically entitled to do any kind of inspection that he or she wants to do. So this means the normal termite, it means the It means, sorry, I'm just trying to stop sharing. It means your normal termite, it means your radon test, it means your standard home inspection. Buyers can bring in contractors, buyers can do sewer scopes, they could bring in an electrician, they could bring in a roofer. And then there's always the fun stucco conversation. So when it comes to this, if you have a buyer, you have the right to request any form of inspection that you so desire. It's always going to be the buyer's cost to perform an inspection. The only exception to that is the well water test. If you have well water, our contract addendas say that the seller is responsible to provide a well water cert to the buyer. And so that's at the seller's expense. Normally, we don't have much of an issue. You have your home inspector go out, they have a termite guy comes and meet them, and then the radon canister gets left behind. We do your inspections, and then you go from there. One thing I always recommend to my clients when I have buyers is to try to schedule the inspection as early in the window of time as possible. That way, if something comes up, you have a chance for follow-up. The example I give in almost every introductory conversation I have with a buyer is I say a home inspector is kind of like a general physician. He or she is going to evaluate the house and tell you some obvious things that are wrong, and then say, go see this specialist, go see that specialist. There's a crack in the foundation. I'm not going to tell you it's okay or not okay. Call a structural engineer. The roof's got some shingle issues, call a roofer. There's knob and tube, call an electrician, et cetera, et cetera. So if you do it early in the time frame, that gives you some back end time to have these people come out. Another change that I always request an attorney review is in the event that the home inspector identifies something for which evaluation is recommended, and I will can say with confidence that every one of you on here has seen in probably every home inspection that the home inspector says, recommend further evaluation for something in that report. I'm not qualified to give an opinion on that further recommendation. And unless any of you are contractors, you're not qualified to give an opinion on that either. And if you do, it's where we all get ourselves into trouble. So if an inspector says, recommend for further investigation, you can have a conversation and say, look, here are the last 5 home inspections I've gotten. They say this in all of them. I'm not saying it's a small deal. It may be a big deal, but you can call an electrician and have an electrician come out and give you an opinion. So what I like to do is I like to build in an extra week of time that says if the inspector says get further evaluation on something, we'll still send you our requests, but we also get to reserve to have somebody follow up and give more detail on that. And then that way you're not scrambling to try to get somebody out there on day 13 or 14 and then inevitably failing to do so because the contractors are so busy. Now, one thing that I think is extremely important is in those items where an inspector says, recommend further evaluation. If I have a seller and I receive a repair request and the request says, number 1, chimney, we want the seller to further evaluate the chimney and repair to the extent necessary. Number 2, we want the seller to further evaluate the foundation crack and repair as necessary. If I get a request like that as a seller, my response is, I don't have to evaluate anything. You didn't identify a defect. The contract of sale says that a buyer must identify defective conditions. All right. If something is not, if any physical defects or environmental conditions exist, the seller shall have 7 days after the receipt of such reports to notify the buyer in writing whether they want to correct or not correct. So I'm going to, give me 1 second. I'm going to show you that section here. It says, right, if any physical defects or environmental conditions. This is not saying if an inspector says take a look at something that it becomes the seller's obligation to take a look at it. They do not. The seller is only required to respond to items which are determined to be defective and a repair request is made. Okay. If you see here, the right to inspection, first of all, says that the property is in as-is condition. So to some extent, all properties are as-is, although we've talked about it before with a seller, if you really have a seller that's selling as-is, you should specify it. But aside from that, the buyer at buyer's sole cost and expense is granted the right to have the dwelling and other aspects inspected by qualified inspectors for the purpose of determining the existence of physical defects or environmental conditions. All right. From there, if the buyer chooses to make inspections, they have to be completed, and written reports, including a list of repairs the buyer is requesting, must be furnished to the seller and brokers within however many days. So backing up again, a request to evaluate is not a request to repair a defective condition. Okay, if you have buyers, don't request that a seller evaluate something. That is not the seller's obligation to do it. Get your buyer out there to evaluate it with whatever contractors, ask for extensions, and present an opinion from a qualified inspector or contractor that says, here's what we found, here's what's wrong with it, and then if it's a contractor, here's what we recommend you do, and here's the cost. That's ideal, because then you can negotiate credits, or you can negotiate repairs, or if the seller refuses, you can back out of the contract and you're 100% entitled to your deposit back. Okay, it's very important to do it that way. There are many, many times where I get the evaluate, and I just say, we're not evaluating anything. It's not our job to pay $750 for a structural engineer to come out and take a look at that teeny tiny horizontal crack in the wall that is a settlement crack that we all know is probably a settlement crack, but we're not going to have a structural engineer evaluate it. You want to know what it is, the buyer has to pay the money to do that. The other important thing here is that language that talks about submitting a list within 14 days. I'm going to show it one more time. This is very, very important. During this time period, there is absolutely no right for a buyer to, on day 13, write an email or send a letter to the seller that says, I'm canceling the contract because I don't find the inspection acceptable. This form of contract does not allow for that. If you have a seller and they get this letter, you have a couple options. Option number one is you can be nice and you can write back and say, now you need to send us a list. What you sent us isn't acceptable. The contract says we need to know what the list is. What do you want repaired? If you don't want to be so nice and you absolutely are in your right mind to do this, and I've had to do it in some instances before, is you can just wait until day 15 comes, and then you can say, pursuant to paragraph 14D and E of the contract, you never sent over a list of repairs, therefore the contingency is waived. And the reason that it's waived is because that paragraph then goes on to say, if buyer fails to furnish such reports to seller and broker within 14 calendar days, this contingency shall be deemed waived by the buyer, and the property shall be deemed acceptable by buyer. The time period for purchasing these is referred to as the inspection time period. So if your inspection time period runs and you don't make requests within the 14-day period, as a buyer, you're out of luck, unless you have a seller who wants to be very nice and have a conversation about whether or not they want to consider requests or grant extensions. Now, again, the idea is in most instances, you have a buyer that wants to buy and a seller that wants to sell. And if you can be constructive, it's better to give up a little bit and make something work rather than having a buyer say, fine, I'm not going to buy the house and I'm going to disappear and we're going to litigate this, because nobody wins when it litigates except for the litigation attorneys. Now, I'll say this here, I'm not a litigation attorney. I don't handle litigation, but I know what the litigation attorneys charge. They have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of time investment, and going to court is expensive. And in most instances, when I talk to people that have had to sue, unless you're suing over a really big loss because the contract was breached, everybody walks away unhappy because they pay the lawyers and ultimately they don't get what they really want anyway. So if you have a buyer, don't miss those deadlines. If you think you need an extension, 99% of realtors that I deal with are really level-headed and fair and say, look, I understand you just got your report and you need 2 more days. Not a problem. Can you send me the report that you got? We'll give you 24 hours or 48 hours to get over the request. That's fine. It's a lot easier to ask for it before you miss the deadline than after you miss the deadline and you're hoping to get something back. If you miss the deadline, make a request, plead, and basically explain, do your best to try to negotiate for your client. Sometimes sellers are still willing to give you a couple $100 to just say, all right, that's fine, but not always. And sellers don't have to. And if you have a seller, you can tell them you don't have to do anything now. The buyer is out of luck. It's up to you what you want to do. All right, and that's obviously subject to still any appraisal requirements or things like that would come. But just be careful about that and really be mindful of the inspection deadlines and what is constituting a defect. Now, something else that you will see is you'll get a request as a seller's agent that'll have the entire report listed. Usually that's a red flag that a buyer wants to get out of the contract. Sometimes it's a first-time home buyer thing where first-time home buyers will think that they should get a new home and they want every little nook and cranny fixed. And that's just due to them being them, and sometimes it's difficult. And as a seller, you can respond accordingly. If you have a seller who really needs to sell a house and they get a 30-something item request list and it's everything in the contract, tell your sellers this buyer might be looking to get out. And if you say no to anything on this list that's a defect, the buyer has the absolute right to cancel and get their deposit back. So the inspection contingency does allow a seller to trap a buyer under the way that it's drafted. If the seller says yes to everything, buyer's stuck. They're going to have to move forward with the one exception. The only item that can come back that is a defect that a buyer can cancel carte blanche is if the radon is over the 4.0 picocentiliters per liter. If that comes in, the contract does not give the ability for a seller to automatically have the right to correct that. As a seller's attorney, I always make that change and I always give the seller the right of first refusal on that. But if you have a buyer and the contract's not altered and it comes in at 4.1, they can cancel the contract and the seller gets no say as to that. Let me see, there's one other thing I wanted to mention.
What
Now,
if the seller says, what if the seller has in the contract for the buyer's interest only? The inspections for the buyer's
so
interest only.
this is a great question. This is one that I love. So it'll say in the contract's not altered. Everything is there exactly as you see. And then we'll get to paragraph 43. And let me scroll down. And it'll say right here, right below this section, inspections are for informational purposes only. Well, what does that mean? Well, if I go to get that contract, the first thing I'll look is I'll go back up here and I'll see that paragraph 16 hasn't been crossed out. There's no lines drawn through anything. There's nothing that's been deleted. That to me does not remove the seller's or the buyer's right to be able to still make demands. All you've said is there for informational purposes. You probably defined it as is sale. You may have even said seller will not agree to make repairs. What that provision doesn't say in that instance is buyer does not have the right to cancel the contract if defects are found. If it doesn't say that or something along those lines, the buyer can absolutely send over a request and the seller's going to turn around and say, I told you I wasn't doing anything. And the buyer's going to say, great, you rejected my requests. Now I'm going to cancel and I get my deposit back. So if your intent is to truly make it where the inspection is just for informational purposes, it can serve absolutely no purpose for the buyer, make sure you clearly specify that to be the case. Because if you haven't deleted the ability of the buyer to make requests and cancel if they're rejected, then the buyer retains that right. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. Now, if you have a buyer and that's the case, and some of their language is in there saying you're taking this as is, where is, you're waiving rights to inspections and all those things, make sure you have communications in writing with your buyer, send emails, get responses where your buyer acknowledges that they know that it doesn't matter if the house is found out to be falling down, that they have to proceed with this, because otherwise, inevitably, they're going to turn around and scream at you and say, why didn't you tell me that I don't get the right to do this, that, or the other? So document it in writing for your own protection, because buyers have very short memories when they don't get answers they like, and who they want to blame is generally the people that they talk to most, which is either you guys or us as lawyers. So make sure you just document that for your own protection. All right. Next, I want to talk just a couple minutes, not in too much detail, about bulk sales. This is a topic that is one that I actually have done an entire lecture on. So we'll talk about it just for a minute. But so in the contract, we have bulk sales. So bulk sales is a protection that the state of New Jersey has built in really to protect itself, to make sure that there's no sorts of collectible taxes that the state is entitled to that they're walking away from. So this really only applies to multi-dwelling units, does not apply to a simple dwelling house or the sale of a seasonal rental property. It applies to commercial buildings. It applies to homes that are properties that are owned by an entity that are not engaged in the business of buying and selling homes. So flippers are not subject to bulk sales. But if you know, your mom and pop shop down the street owns a home, but they don't, not in the business of renting or selling, they are subject to bulk sales. So typically my recommendation for bulk sales is if you have something that's 3 units or more, it applies. If it's owned by an entity that is not in the business of buying or selling real estate, it applies. What it means is you have to go onto the website. You can go to you can frankly Google NJ bulk sale form, put in your buyer's information, send it to the seller's agent. The seller's agent fills in the information. You send it to the state of New Jersey with a copy of the contract at least 10 days before your sale. New Jersey sends back a letter saying either you're good or you have to escrow money at the time of closing. The reason you do it is if you don't do it and the property was subject to bulk sales, it means that the state could come after your client, the new owner, after closing to collect money that is owed by the prior seller for unrelated taxes, and they can put a lien on the property. So again, 3 or more units, any commercial property, or any property that's owned by an entity or basically a non-individual, or an entity that's not involved in flipping or purchasing and selling real estate, bulk sales would apply. When in doubt, call your title company. They can usually help, or even better, call a lawyer. We'll be able to tell you if bulk sales applies or not. It's a free document. Sellers often freak out saying, I'm not doing this, I'm not paying for this. It doesn't cost anything. The seller literally puts down their name, their address, and their tax ID number. That's all they have to supply. It's very unintrusive. And it provides a lot of coverage. I've seen plenty of times where it comes back with no escrow, and I've seen up to $120,000 have to be escrowed before. And what happens is if it's something where a company doesn't file tax returns, the state says, we haven't gotten a tax return from you in 5 years, 100 grand. Give us a call and we'll reduce that probably right away, but we want to start a dialogue with you because you haven't paid your taxes. And so it's a way to get attention of those that don't pay attention. All right. Like I said, go
I just want to pop in here. Greg is going to be doing a bulk sales training just for bulk sales this coming Tuesday at 10 a.m. So we can make sure that that link gets sent out to all the offices. Because, I mean, last time he did this bulk sales class, Carrie and I decided we were quitting real estate. This is a lot of information. It seems simple, but it's like, oh, I'm not doing that. So it's a really good class. So Tuesday morning, the 9th, 10 a.m. Okay, that's all.
Thanks. And just one other thing is it will show up as an exception on your client's title policy. It is not covered by title insurance. And I only know of one title company that actually requires it before they'll close it. Weichert Title, believe it or not, I don't know if they still do, used to flag it as a condition of closing that they get the bulk sale. I have not seen any other title company that does that, but Weichert Title at least used to. All right, next, let's move on to paragraph 23 briefly. We're still doing okay on time. I'm gonna wrap this up so I can give some time for more questions. So we'll kind of burn through these next few items. All right, paragraph 23, really quickly here is maintenance and condition of the property. This is what I like to call the second bite at the apple provision, because basically the way that this paragraph reads, and I have it here for you so you can see it, is that the seller is gonna maintain the property subject to ordinary wear and tear, and that everything will be in broom clean condition and working at the time of closing. Well, you just did a home inspection, and let's say that the furnace wasn't working, and according to the way this paragraph could be interpreted, even if you didn't ask for it, or if you did ask for it and the seller says no, you could theoretically turn around the day before closing and say, hey, you were supposed to make sure the furnace was working, it's not working, we want you to fix it now. I don't believe that that's the intent, the spirit of this paragraph, but one of the changes I always make in attorney review is to say the condition of the property is going to be in the same condition as it was on the day of the home inspection. So that way, if something breaks after the home inspection, by all means, that's why you're doing walkthroughs. That's what they exist for. But you don't get the ability to try to negotiate on the home inspection. The seller says no, and then you get to try to claim under this paragraph that the seller has an obligation. This paragraph seems to say that, but it's not. That is not the intention of why that's there. It's not good faith negotiation. So the idea is if you had a chance to inspect it and your inspector missed it, that's conversation for you with your inspector. If it was in that condition and you decided not to ask for it, you don't get to double back down the day of closing and try to extort the seller for some money because now you want to try to get some more money. All right, next, just walkthroughs. So yes, you do get 2 walkthroughs according to the contract. Most of the time, you really only need the one, and hopefully your buyers aren't dragging you for walkthrough after walkthrough. The only times that I generally find that an initial walkthrough is worthwhile is if you had a contract that had an inspection that yielded a lot of repairs. I don't like the idea of having to look at 20 repairs the morning of closing. I'm sure that we've all had to experience something like that. And you're going through with your list and trying to check things off, and you're trying to act like a contractor or an inspector and follow things along. It's difficult to do. So if you can schedule that walkthrough once you get word the work is done, hopefully, a week or so in advance, it gives you the ability to say, you missed these 3 items. Can you get your contractor back out to take care of them? And then we'll just double check those on the morning of closing and we'll be good to go. That's usually really helpful. If you have something where you're just getting a credit, you really don't need an initial walkthrough. You're going to go through the day of closing or the night before, typically like the day of if possible, and just make sure the house hasn't fallen down and that nothing crazy has changed in the condition since you saw it. If you have a property that is being sold or purchased that is over $1 million, it is subject to the New Jersey mansion tax. It's obviously only in certain instances, but it's over $1 million. There's a reason why you'll see so many houses that are up in that range sell for exactly $1 million. $1.1 million generates a large tax. Don't sell or buy a property for $1.1 million or $1.2 million. It's not worth it. Don't take a credit that sets you over that limit. A lot of times what people will do is sellers or buyers will negotiate. I've seen this happen a lot of times. It's kind of an end around, is if you're going to buy a house that's, let's say, $1.05 million, buyer will say, I'll pay the commissions off the sheet. Let me buy it for $1 million. So that way I'm not paying the seller tax or the mansion tax. It's another 10 grand out of their pocket. So they kind of negotiate different ways. So some of you that handle some of the bigger properties, I'm sure you have seen many ways to kind of try to work around that. You do have to be careful though, because the state of New Jersey does monitor these larger sales. They want their cut. So just be mindful, it's the only tax that exists that applies to the buyer and not the seller. So if you buy a property over $1 million, unless you negotiate it the other way, it's a buyer tax. The seller still pays a realty transfer tax, but the buyer pays the mansion tax. Also, speaking of adjustments at closing, if you have a North Jersey attorney involved as a seller, they will almost always ask or demand that the title appearance fee not be split. North Jersey attorneys generally handle and process everything on their end. They close remotely, even though now we all close remotely essentially when you have a seller. But it is standard for that to be one of the changes that come in the North Jersey letters. The way that I typically handle things is, again, based on that I-195 line of demarcation. If I have a buyer and the property's in Burlington County and a seller tries to change that, I fight tooth and nail, because it's in New Jersey. In South Jersey, it's our custom that they split it. Properties in Burlington County, you're going to play by Burlington County rules. If it's up in Somerset County, I completely understand and agree. We all pay all the appearance fees if we're buying a property up there, because that's the way that it's done in the locale. So that's something just to be mindful of if you have a North Jersey attorney involved in the deal. Attorney review. We all know what attorney review is. We've all seen it. We've all had every contract that's done by a realtor subject to it. Just as a heads up, this is something that if you receive a contract for one of your clients, and I do this for all of my clients, the first thing I do is to look, see if this paragraph is in here. Somebody had made a comment earlier that some of these contracts look similar, but they're not always similar. As attorneys, we do not have to include attorney review provisions in our contracts. It's one of the advantages, in fact, that we have is I have some agents that approach me to write contracts for their buyers in this market. And the reason I do is I'll do it without an attorney review provision. It's very, very similar to the standard contract. I do change some things and basically incorporate the attorney review changes I would make depending if it's a buyer or seller. But it allows you to avoid that 3-day waiting period if you have a buyer or a seller still accumulating more offers. The advantage of that is it stops the process and you immediately go forward once it's executed. But if you're presented with a contract and it does not have the attorney review language, that means it's not subject to attorney review, which means as soon as it's signed, it's a binding contract. There are no changes. There are no modifications. Your client is bound to those terms and subject to the conditions therein. So just be careful. There is a contract that goes around that has a lot of the provisions that looks like the standard contract, and it changes the financing. I've seen this one, and I know many of you have, that basically says in the event your client can't get a mortgage commitment within, generally they give you 10 days, we'll provide you financing at rates that we think are fair, and you don't have the right to get out unless we say we can't give you financing. It's a problem contract. It's one particular flipper that does it. I haven't seen it in a while, but it's just something to be careful of. If you get a contract, especially an attorney prepared contract, it most likely does not have attorney review in it. So make sure you read every word. Don't just assume that the heading says inspections, that it's our general inspection phase, because it's likely got something tweaked in it. So just kind of be careful about that. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is the final section of the contract, the additional provisions. So you do have the ability in one other section to add language to the contract, and we've kind of danced around it a little bit. You can feel free to use that section 43. It's open-ended. I often see provisions that are put in there. The caution that I'm going to give you is just to remember, whatever you put in that contract is now a legal term as a part of a legally binding contract. Okay, and it's perfectly fine. You're within your rights to add things. Make sure that what you put in there is exactly what you think it says and what it means, because if you put something in that contract and it is not exactly what you mean it to be, it can't be changed. And now you've drafted a legal provision to a contract and it could result in some issues. So the example that I always give, and many of you have heard me speak before, so you've heard me give this example before, but I'm going to do it again because this is the good one that I have, is an agent wrote in a provision that said the seller will agree to repair any and all items up to a total of $5,000 in paragraph 16D of the contract of sale. So as we remember, 16D dealt with your home inspection and any defects that came up. So that was the only change that was added in that provision. Buyer goes, does a home inspection, sends in an invoice from a contractor for $4,999 for repairs. Seller says, okay, no problem. And also then attaches to that a termite certification that says that the house needs termites and has $3,700 worth of termite damage. Seller says, you sent over to me $49.99. You also sent me over $3,700 of termite, and you sent me an $810 treatment. And it's over $5,000. I'm not interested. I'm going to go to a new buyer. Buyer responds and says, no, you're not, because paragraph 16C of the contract talks about termites, termite related damage, and you have that as 1% of the purchase price. It's $1 million home. Mine is well below 1% of the purchase price. So you've agreed to that in paragraph 16C. Your modification for paragraph 16D said you're going to pay me up to $5,000 for repairs, hence my invoice for $4,999. So I want a total of $9,600 or you to do the work. Otherwise, I'm going to sue you because you're in breach of contract. Guy says, no, that's not what I intended it to be. It was supposed to be $5,000 for everything. The agent's the one that wrote it up. They went back and forth. The agent ended up paying for the termite treatment and the termite repairs because he or she improperly drafted the addendum and had it in good intentions. Everything was right in the way that he or she meant to do it, but it wasn't drafted right. So I always say, if you're going to put something in the contract, assume that 3 people are going to read it. Your client and your client's attorney, the other client, the other side, their attorney, and a judge. And the only opinion that really matters is the judge's opinion. And if you write a legal term, that doesn't mean we think it doesn't hurt your client or hurt somebody else. Unfortunately, it's going to fall back on you. So if you write things, it's perfectly fine. Just make sure what you write is exactly what you mean and just be careful. All right. So with that, that's kind of my spiel on the contract. I'm happy to open up for questions if anybody's got any.
Greg,
Yep.
you know, we're in all these multiple offers. And so we're seeing all kinds of things where, and I have basically 2 questions. One is that I recently heard that even if someone is putting, let's say 10 to 20% down and waives the appraisal, that there are some mortgage companies that will not lend based on a change to that. And I don't understand that. Have you encountered that?
I haven't seen that yet. I can envision why. I mean, every lender has their own internal policies and we can't force a lender to adhere to it. The problem with that is if you have a buyer that's in that situation, if the lender is willing to issue you a denial, that's you could end up in a fight because let's set this premise. The denial comes and usually there's a reason for why the mortgage gets denied. If the mortgage gets denied because the property didn't appraise, if I'm a seller, I'm going to write back to them and say, well, my question for you is, yes, it didn't appraise, but does the buyer qualify financially to cover that appraisal? And if their response is, oh, it's our policy that we don't do that, I'm going to say, well, then you didn't diligently perform your mortgage because you actually signed a contract that you were ready to violate immediately because you hired a lender who couldn't perform within the terms of the contract, which means you didn't give them that contract up front. And again, how far down the line you want to fight that is up to you. But I think that's something that if you have a buyer and you plan on waiving an appraisal, make sure your buyer has that conversation with the lender up front. I haven't yet seen that. That's really interesting.
The second thing is when you're putting in something that limits how much the seller is going to pay, whether it's like the first 1,000 to 5,000 will be borne by the buyer, or the seller won't pay more than 5. What do you feel is the best way to handle that so it doesn't revert to something else that's in the contract? How would you advise that people address that?
So if you're going to create monetary amounts that address repairs or modifications, you want to make a blanket statement that any and all repairs, upgrades, corrections, modifications, whatever, use a couple different words to throw in there, that are contemplated within this contract of sale shall be limited at such and such amount. And then you could do an including but not limited to certificate of occupancy, any and all forms of inspections, any lender requirements. I mean, that's generally the 3 that would most likely come up. The thing that I always kind of makes those numbers difficult is, quantifying them. So if I'm a seller and we put something in that says, won't consider any repair requests unless there's more than $5,000 worth of defects, certificate of occupancy, lender required repairs. Essentially, if I'm a seller, I want to see invoices that show they're more than $5,000 because I'm not going to go price it out if you send me a list of defects, right? I mean, that's not my job. I'm not in the job of evaluating. I'm the seller. If you're a buyer, realistically, in almost any house, you can find $5,000 worth of defects if you hire the right contractor. I mean, that's not hard to do. So those provisions to me don't really do a lot.
Does single defect work if you say that,
that's a good one. I don't like that one. If I'm a buyer, I try to dissuade my buyers from signing that because you could have 50 defects that are $900 if you have 1,000, and then that's a lot of problems.
Yeah.
So I think the cumulative is the idea, and the one that I don't mind as much is if you actually take out and say, look, I'm concerned about the foundation, I'm concerned about the roof, I'm concerned about environmental conditions. Aside from that, essentially, I'm willing to accept the property,
And
but
as-
I'm going to have, and then in that instance, you should be prepared to have a structural engineer go out if you need it. You should be prepared to have a roofer go out, and you should be prepared to have mold testing or radon or whatever else. Because in those instances, I think that's kind of the big ticket items. And as long as you have disclosures on your HVAC, I mean, if you know how old the systems are, I don't like people walking in and finding out that a furnace is 30 years old that was never disclosed. That's one of the big issues I have with the changes that you'll see oftentimes. It's a useful life, you know, the age of the system is irrelevant. Those I only think are applicable if you've actually disclosed the age of the system. If you don't tell them how old a system is and they can't figure it out, how is it fair to go in and say, well, it's a 40-year-old furnace. It's still working. Yeah, but you never told me it was 40 years old. Or worse, if you misrepresented and said that it's 10 years old, that changes the conversation. But back to, sorry to digress, but back to the monetary amounts. The other one that works a lot of times is, you know, seller will agree to consider defects in the event they're over such and such amount of money, but the buyer will credit the seller essentially $5,000. So in that instance, if you send over a list of repairs, and let's say it comes out to be, it's going to be $8,000 to fix everything. If I'm a seller, I'm going to say, great, I'm going to give you a seller credit of $3,000. You fix it after closing, you bit the first $5,000 off. That tends to work, I think, in a lot of instances.
Okay.
Yeah. Other questions? I can kind of go through the chat here. Oh, good.
Undisclosed in-ground oil tanks. You scan the yard, you find one.
Yep.
Not necessarily an environmental condition until we find out if it leaks. However, the buyer wants out. They don't even want to go, there's an in-ground oil tank now, it was undisclosed. Does the buyer have a right to immediately cancel the contract, or does further testing, and what's the time limit of how much time you have to play with?
So this is a really good question. Now, first and foremost, you want to see if they provided a seller disclosure. If there's a seller disclosure and there's nothing checked off about oil tank, as soon as you find that oil tank, essentially my position is you didn't disclose this. You knew or should have known about it. My clients aren't comfortable. We're out. It's a misrepresentation. It's a failure to disclose. It's essentially fraud. We're not going to move forward. You throw around all the big words if your client wants out. If it's disclosed to you that there's something, well, then in the disclosure, the first thing I'm going to say in my attorney reviewer as an agent, as soon as you see that disclosure, is we want it out. I don't care if it's filled with sand. I don't care if it's leaking, not leaking. Get it out. Make that a point for the other side. But to your question, if it's not disclosed and your client wants out, I would immediately throw around, you should have disclosed this, you should have known. The only instances where you run into problems with that is you have a bank or somebody that's never lived at the property and that's why they didn't provide a disclosure. If it's reasonable for them to have no idea, then in that instance, it's an environmental condition. The contract doesn't really provide that you have the immediate right to walk away. But what happens is, realistically, for them to get it out within your closing timeline is oftentimes not feasible, and you're not required to extend the contract in order to allow them time to get a tank out. Because your clients may need to move into the house on that closing date, and 6 months later doesn't work, 6 weeks later doesn't work, and they're not required to agree to an escrow. They're not required to take occupancy of the house and have it done after closing. And there's another big one. Sellers that offer credits in lieu of repairs, buyers are not required to accept credits. Buyers ask for repairs. If you offer a credit instead of repairs, a buyer can say, no, I asked you to repair. You didn't say yes, I want out of the contract. So with oil tanks, usually you get a lot of leeway because they really should have known, or they should have been able to figure it out as an owner. But the contract is not clear and specific on it. And that's why you'll see a lot of times attorney review addendums comment on, in the event there's no oil tank found, the buyer either can cancel, or if the seller, or can give the seller the opportunity, if the seller won't remove it, then they can cancel. And that's regardless of leakage.
Should an oil tank addendum go with every contract regardless of if it's disclosed or not disclosed?
Not a bad idea. There's no harm to it. If you have a buyer to put that in there, there's no harm to it.
Second part of my question, solar panels are now at the age where they're 10 to 20 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Starting to have every system checked, inspected. The contracts mute on solar panels, but it's a system of the house, or is it? And
So,
the other thing is,
it is a fixture.
it is a fixture. So I just had one where half the panels were only 50% working, but they're working, but only at 50%. Does the contract speak to that? I mean,
So there is a solar panel.
replacing solar panels?
So there is a solar panel addendum now that I've seen go around. I guess the question is there's kind of two parts to solar panels. One, if you have the panels that are currently being leased, almost every contract that I've seen essentially says that the company that's providing the panels is obligated to maintain them during the life of the lease. So if they are failing or start to fail, they have to not only maintain the panels, but they also maintain the roof and any damage that's associated with it. If the seller owns the panels outright and they're responsible for the maintenance, that's 100% something that you can make a request. It's a defect. The panels aren't functioning properly, they're defective. Either we want them off and you fix the roof, or you replace them with panels that function.
The leases I'm seeing don't contain the language that they're maintained by the company. You're seeing that?
Yeah, I see that. I mean, Sonova, Tesla, Solar City, they all the ones that I'm seeing generally have 20-year periods. They'll maintain it for 20 years, and at the end of the 20-year term, they'll take them off, and then they usually give you a 1-year weather warranty on your roof. That being said, the solar panels are a nightmare.
Yeah.
That's a separate conversation altogether.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Greg, some of the questions we had in the chat, some of them you had answered, but let me start from the top.
Sure.
Laura had asked, in section 9 of the contract, CO and zoning compliance, can a realtor write any dollar amount in there? The 1.5% that is will revert to if left blank is a large amount.
Yeah, that's one of the things you can write in there. Most commonly, I see 250, 500. Those are probably the most common numbers. If you're in a town that's a smoke cert only, if you're selling in Marlton, realistically, you can write whatever you want because you have to get the cert because it's all equipment. But most of the South Jersey towns are 250, 500. If you're Pennsauken, make sure you change it because otherwise you're basically writing a blank check for your seller without giving them discretion.
You covered that before, so thank you so much for that.
Yeah, no problem.
Next question was, how does the COVID-19 addendum changes the date in the contract?
So every brokerages are slightly different. Usually what they do is they basically say if somebody can demonstrate that they've actually been impacted by COVID, it'll extend things for 30 days. And then it gives it, after that 30 days, at least the majority of the ones I see, give either party the right to terminate the contract. They have to actually show that something has affected them. Now, realistically, if you're a buyer and you've been affected by COVID, often what it means is you've had an issue with your job, which means you probably don't qualify for the loan anymore. So what it's trying to do is that gives you a 30-day extension to hopefully get your finances in order and re-qualify for your loan. If you're a seller, the only real instances that I foresee occurring is if basically you're sick and you can't get out. And I had this one occurred where I had somebody that was sick. We had to postpone closing for them to get better and finish their quarantine, and that fell under the COVID addendum. But aside from that, it actually requires legitimate documentation. You can't just say, this COVID stuff is a problem. It's slowing me down. I can't keep up. I'm too busy. Blah, blah. That doesn't kick the COVID addendum in. You need something from a professional, like from a medical professional, or something in writing from an employer, or something that actually triggers it.
The next question was, does the seller have the right to have a copy of the full appraisal if there are repairs being requested by the lender?
Yeah, I think we hit on this one, that if they request repairs or if they're requesting to change the purchase price, demand the full appraisal.
And Marianne, your question about the oil tank, and why is the poet paragraph even still in there?
Because there's got to be at least one somewhere in the state. So the state just says, just in case we have it covered, because there's no inspection that goes out and tags every property to see where they are. It's also a way for the state to figure out what properties may still have them. Same thing with the cesspool.
And that's it that I saw in the chat. Anybody else have some final questions?
Sure, Miriam.
I have 2 listings coming up. Is it enough to put in the agent notes just the COVID warning, or do you suggest that I still have everybody fill out a hold harmless that's going to show the house?
I mean, here's the thing with those hold harmlesses. They're barely worth the
Not worth it.
on, because honestly, if somebody wants to sue you, they're going to sue you. If somebody, you know what I mean? And this is, I have a couple of HOAs I represent, and this is the conversation with the pools, is whether or not to open the pools. And the idea was, we'll have everybody sign a waiver. And I'm like, yeah, that's great. But if they get sick and then pass it to somebody else, they're going to then sue everybody they've been in contact with.
I am an acting president of an HOA, and I am sick to my stomach over opening the amenities. It's insane.
Yeah, it's
insane.
Not a fun decision to make.
Yes.
Yeah, there's no, look, having them sign it doesn't hurt you. It gives you an extra, like, it may dissuade somebody that otherwise might have come after you. So from a lawyer's perspective, waivers are great. but any lawyer can argue around any lawyer that's worth their salt. So
Thank you.
nope. No problem.
Looks like we got a couple of other ones. Is there a way to protect the seller against damage done by a home inspector?
So that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, if you come back and see your home right after a home inspection, there's something that's done. One thing to do is immediately reach out to the other agent and say, I just came home and this has been done. Basically, the home inspectors all have insurance. So, you know, theoretically, you can you contact that inspector and say, you damaged my fireplace. You tried to turn the fireplace on, the pilot light wasn't lit. What'd you do? You broke something trying to turn the gas on. You know, you better put your insurance company on notice, or you need to come out and fix this. You could theoretically add a provision in the contract that say that the buyer is responsible for any damage caused by their inspector. But again, this is the reason why the inspectors have insurance. And so if something happens, contacting the inspector directly and letting them know we're going to come after your insurance is usually effective. Document it
And the next
immediately.
one is, does the estoppel certificate request need to be in the contract, or just ask the selling agent for it?
I would add it to the contract provisions. Usually the most times when I see things with tenants, a lot of times it's commercial properties, and you'll see, if you've ever done commercial, you'll see the contracts have a laundry list of seller deliveries, tenant estoppel letters being one of them. You can just add in there, if you have a tenant, that we'd like a tenant estoppel letter prior to or at the time of closing. But even if it's not in there, it's still something you should be able to reasonably ask for, because if they've disclosed things about the tenancy, you should be expecting to get all the documentation about the tenancy.
I'm sorry, James, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. We got about 2 more minutes left.
Oh, okay. Temporary CO, regards to kind of have a situation, temporary CO. The buyer is getting a temporary CO, and then they have a full-blown CO they have to get after that, I assume, another payout. Is the seller obligated on any of this stuff after all that's acquired, and is some repairs to be met, even if they don't want to or disagree with it?
So if you're closing on a TCO, temporary CO, as a buyer, either one of two things should have happened. Either the buyer should have gotten a credit or something to negotiate as to why they're accepting the TCO, or there needs to be money escrowed to guarantee that the seller is going to finalize out that certificate of occupancy. Most of the time, you're not going to close on a residential deal with a temporary, unless you're a contractor, flipper, or something like that. You're basically saying, we're going to rehab the place. I don't need a CO right now. If you're a buyer that's going to plan on move in and you're closing on a TCO, you definitely want money escrowed, unless it's really something that was pre-negotiated as to why they would be taking it that way.
Greg, who could hold that escrow?
Okay.
Title companies often will hold them, depending on it. Some brokerages will hold them. Some attorneys will hold them. My experience is, if there's an attorney involved in the transaction, a lot of times the attorney will agree to hold it. Most lawyers, myself included, don't like to hold escrows for deals that we're not involved in. Some title companies will. It just depends on which title company you contact. Like YHT does hold escrows. I knew that. I closed on one yesterday for a commercial. They held money for a TCO. Some won't, and some brokerages allow it. I don't think yours does, but some do.
So if the seller is not going to do any repairs, and you got a temporary CO, he still says he's not doing any repairs. Is he out? I mean, he's really out completely, and the buyer is on the hook for it regardless?
Well, so you're not required to close unless there's a provision in the contract that says the buyer agrees to accept the temporary CO. The buyer doesn't have to close. The contract provides the seller is going to obtain the certificate of occupancy unless it's otherwise negotiated. And a seller can't just the day before closing say, I got you a TCO, we're done. I'm not doing anything. If I have a buyer.
I'm sorry. This situation is the buyer is getting a temporary CO. The county, the area we're talking about, they can't come out the house because of COVID. They're not going to people's homes to do a CO because of COVID. So we have to close with a temporary CO. Then they're going to come out after it's already closed, and the seller doesn't want to be responsible for any repairs after closing.
Yeah, I would demand an escrow, because their obligation is to get a CO. To me, them saying, yep, this is great, my tenant only requires the TCO, and then they'll inspect later, is a great way for the seller to avoid their obligation. That should have been negotiated. If that was the seller's intention, from the go, the contract should have been negotiated in a way where the seller says, I'm spending 0 towards the CO. If it's the seller's obligation to get the CO and they can't get it, then money should be escrowed, and you should make the demand that money be escrowed to allow the buyer to avoid that responsibility. Because otherwise, I don't know, if it's, like I said, if it's a town that just has a smoke and fire, you're probably not in too bad of shape. You may need to replace something that's fairly minor. But if you have a full inspection, your client could be on the hook for thousands of dollars potentially. I mean, you have no idea. I mean, you had a home inspection, you have some idea, but the towns find things that the home inspectors don't sometimes. So
Yeah, the way I
And I think
worked
we
it out
have,
was I
one
gave
more
the
question. Let's go to
go
Dawn.
ahead.
for
Okay,
her
James,
last
go ahead.
question. And I also put Greg's information in the chat window. So if you have any last minute questions, you can also email him there. But Dawn, real quickly,
go Don. Don, you're muted.
you're on mute. Hold the space bar. That should unmute you. No? Bottom left-hand side of the Zoom screen, you should see the unmute button.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so just quick, I'm brand new today, just got my license today. You keep mentioning about a CO in Pennsauken. I don't need to know this, a lot of the details, because I'm sure it's complicated, but where would I look to get some research, like what is different in Pennsauken that I need to know about?
If you go on any of the websites for any of the towns, usually it's in the, either the building and construction department, or I mean, you can Google resale certificate for the town. They all have it on in their different departments where it's located. And Pennsauken has a specific form that says, here's the form to fill out. And I think there's actually a checklist, if I'm not mistaken, for Pennsauken, or at least a little bit of a list. But they all have their requirements and what they need. Some towns are easy. Some towns have 2. For example, Cherry Hill, you need to do the exterior inspection and the smoke and fire. Marlton, you need a smoke. Medford, you need a sewer and a smoke and fire.
Willingborough's
town has,
tough, too.
what's that?
Willingboroughs can be tough too.
Yeah, Willingboroughs can be tough. Voorhees, you need a survey and a CO. So it depends on each town, has different requirements.
Your processor from your title company would be a really good resource.
It's a good one too.
Thank you so much, appreciate it.
Yep.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for taking this call for us. We appreciate your time.
Pleasure.
It's always a pleasure having you.
Thanks for everybody for coming in.
Guys,
Appreciate
thanks.
your time. Good questions. And everybody take care. And I think James included my email on there. So anything, you can always feel free to reach out.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.